Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Chatting with the Lightkeeper. As always, I'm Edward, and well, here in my fair city, summer has fully arrived in all its hot, humid glory. I mean, today is sort of, if you're outside for any length of time, you actually can kind of feel like you are wearing the air. It's that muggy and humid. This morning there were some nice storms that came through, which my lawn was grateful for the water. But now that the rain has gone and the sun has come out, it is insanely humid, which means it is definitely going to storm again later this evening. So I thought before it storms again, and the storms this morning briefly, just, long enough to have to reset every clock in the house and the microwave and the all important coffee maker. Resetting those clocks. I thought before it gets booming again, I would get the podcast recorded. And with the insane summer warmth and humidity, somehow my mind recently turned to this mild mannered janitor who comes in contact with some, toxic goo and suddenly becomes sort of, I don't know, a mutated vigilante, shall we say. And what I'm talking about, you may have heard of. It's called The Toxic Avenger. It was a movie that first came out in 1984, kind of well, it definitely is a low budget horror slash comedy flick. And it's, a bit satirical, and it, of course, um, did for a low budget film fairly well, which means that it quickly sort of grew a little life of its own. There were graphic novels, there are comic books, there were more movies, I think five or six altogether. And of course, now the Toxic Avenger is part of the marvelous Marvel verse. If there's a Marvel verse of universe of Marvel characters. I'm not a big comic book graphic artist or graphic novel person. Um, although graphic novels is where I first did pick up on what later became the TV show Burn Notice. But anyway, the Toxic Avenger, ran its course. And thinking back to the Toxic Avenger movies and a few of the comic books that I'd seen, that got me thinking about really, obviously, this problem extends beyond just the lifestyle, but it is here in the lifestyle. And so, you know, as the Toxic Avenger Spanks again, it got me thinking about toxic masculinity. And for those of you who don't know, toxic masculinity is really where sort of the specific traits of men are, I don't know, amplified uh, or made to be bigger, where they sort of men will be arrogant, dominant, aggressive, suffer from emotional regression. Um, and through all of that crapola, they devalue things that are associated with femininity or vulnerability. They sort of what I would call the caveman mentality. And this, of course, is not healthy, not helpful. And unfortunately, with part of the toxic masculinity traits, the whole aura of I have a penis, therefore I am dominant, comes into play. And that, of course, brings many of these toxic men to BDSM because, hey, it's a place where dominance and submission is readily talked about. It's right there, it's the D and the S of BDSM. And it's incredibly negative and hurtful for the lifestyle. And I guess let's kind of go through a few places where we see it. Unfortunately, in the vanilla world, one place where we see it far too often. Thankfully, I don't see it in my workplace, but I have worked in places where it is on full display, where a man will obviously think less of their female peers and will constantly interrupt or talk over them. try to assert their dominance, and being dismissive of anybody who, doesn't have a penis, their contributions. Um, these also men will, you know, suppress their feelings. They can't show sadness or they can't be vulnerable because that would be weak and unmanly. Your, wonderful parental unit just passed away and you can't even fess up to being sad or even show that you're sad and you're going to miss somebody like that. The other place that is sickening where it shows is with homophobia and misogyny. Let's face it, that happens all the time. And it's not just out in the vanilla world. I mean, you see all of these things within the wonderful world of kink. Now, within BDSM, obviously, other than the misogynistic assholes, the homophobes, and people that choose to suppress their emotions because somehow having a penis means that they need to be emotionally unavailable. In BDSM, it shows up a lot of times with these dominant men. These are a lot of, unfortunately, the people who disregard safe words, they disregard boundaries. It's because, they are men and they are blessed with something between their legs which gives them the power to do this, which is totally not the case. But you see it very often, these, toxic men doing these things. And I'm not saying that women or other genders don't, but it's oftentimes associated, and from what I have seen, firsthand, which is, I guess, anecdotal evidence, that it is these people who feel that they're entitled to dominance because of their gender when it comes from typically from men, which is absolutely horrible. And you also see it um, where these men will want to enforce the stereotypical roles. They are men, therefore they are dominant. And if you are female, you need to be passive and obedient. And they do not respect or understand. I don't even think they try to understand, but they don't respect the fact that the whole lifestyle is a very diverse world where people of all genders can take on all roles. These are typically the dominants who will always be using, he, him for anything dominant and she, her for anything submissive because they can't comprehend a world where it's anything but that. It's going beyond somebody who is sharing a personal preference because people do that all the time in their posts that they might do on social media or in a discussion. Um, your personal preference for the gender you find attractive or the role you find attractive. But these are the people who are always he, him for dominant and she, her for submissive. And sadly, I don't believe, come to the lifestyle with a pure heart. They are not coming because dominance speaks to them. BDSM is a convenient facade. Really, it's a place where they can hide what they know to be toxic and use it to manipulate and control. Um, because BDSM, of course, has the dominant submissive part of it, and they can justify their behavior under the pretext of DS, which is not DS, it's not BDSM because they are exploiting, and they are doing so not with not with a good heart. They are actually coming to the lifestyle and using it to be hurtful. And not only does it hurt their partners, but for the people that are infected with this toxic masculinity, um, it really is hurtful for them because they have, unrealistic ideas of what it means to be a man, which actually causes them emotional distress, to put it mildly, and is definitely going to hurt their mental health. Um, and it's going to create barriers to keep them from getting help that they may need or being able to express vulnerability. So often we see where dominants want their submissive to open up and to be vulnerable for them or be vulnerable to them. And that's understandable. But at the same time, what gets missed, especially when it is somebody who does have the toxic masculinity infection, they don't understand that to get that from a submissive partner, they have to give it. Everything in DS is reciprocal. Everything goes in, sort of like one big circle. Everything keeps feeding that kinktastic part of your relationship. The more a dominant gives, the more a submissive will want to serve or give back, which feeds the dominant to give more, and so on and so forth. It continues to strengthen the relationship where when you have toxic masculinity as part of that, there is no give from the dominant, and the poor submissive is, trying to get things that they need in return, which no matter how you look at DS, submissives, yours, especially if it's your submissive, their needs need to come above the dominance. And unfortunately, toxic masculinity doesn't allow that. And then in the broader scope of things, we talk about the BDSM community. And in the broader scope of things, toxic masculinity really undermines the community, whether it's online or in person. The community, sort of saying that in air quotes, is supposed to be a safe and consensual space where everyone is welcome, everyone can come explore, everyone can, explore, sample, see what they like, see what they don't like, and feel safe about it because, consent rules and safe words rule, and we have all these, all this sort of protection, if you will. But unfortunately, what happens when toxic masculinity creeps into that community, whether it's your local in person or the one you belong to online or perhaps just know of online, when that happens, you start to see power imbalances, you start to see harmful dynamics come to light. And when all this happens, abuse and misconduct come into the community, which hurts everyone. Not only does it hurt, the poor people that are actually on the receiving end of the abuse or the misconduct, but BDSM is a unique place. And it's a saying that when I was a kid, drove me nuts because my mom would repeat it to me to infinity and beyond. And now that I'm an adult, I get it, and I get why she did it. And the saying was or is, you are who your friends are. And it's very important when we think of the kind of greater community that we touch in the world of BDSM. We are often looked at, rightly or wrongly. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if you are in a community filled with toxic masculinity, you're going to be painted with that brush. And it is not a brush that I know I want to be painted with, touched with, or even sort of being adjacent to it. It's always been one of my biggest pet peeves. The whole, you know, your sexuality determines your role. The he, him dominant, she, her submissive. Drives me absolutely bonkers. Always has. Um, And the other thing that it does, toxic masculinity, and it goes, obviously, this goes beyond the community, but if it's present in the community, um, let's face it, toxic masculinity contributes to higher rates of gender based violence, to discrimination, mental health issues. Um, and it's very, very harmful and it limits the chances of having healthy relationships and as well as, progress as society as a whole. And with BDSM being dominance and submission, it is a place where these toxic men can come out and can flap their wings and not necessarily be called out for it, which is, we try to be, accepting in the community. So we, I think, sometimes accept things that we shouldn't. And I think for far too long we tended to and still do in some places take and accept people who are obviously toxic and they're obviously, spreading their toxic masculinity. And we accept that sort of under, well, that's your kink and that's my kink, but that's okay. Rather than saying, no, that's not okay. That's toxic masculinity. And it's it's wrong. So obviously, have not recently been crowned the king of kink. I am not a prince or a princess for that matter, or have any royal powers or any power other than my voice, which is why I wanted to use it today. Because if you sort of don't speak up, you allow things to continue. So what can we do as people with just voices when we see toxic masculinity in the community? First of all, we can endeavor to educate people about, healthy yes relationships, how they promote open communication. Negotiation is a part of it. Everything that's done is consensual and everyone involved, they have a voice and they have agency. They can say no. Um, Also, that within, BDSM, um, boundaries, incredibly important. Safe words, having them be honored, incredibly important. Open communication is how all of this gets negotiated and structured. And we can use our voices to remind people, to educate people that when you run into somebody who doesn't respect boundaries or they are not choosing to, respect your safe word, that they need to run away from these people. And you can often, not always, of course, but many times, reading between the lines when you're talking to a prospective new dominant, especially a male dominant, these toxic masculinity traits will sort of, unfortunately, like cream, rise to the top. They will be visible because as a submissive, you can have conversations about boundaries and limits. The toxic man who feels that they are entitled to do what they want because they have almighty penis between their legs, that will show up like cream. It will rise to the top in some of these conversations. So it's very important that everyone, regardless of their role, not just submissives, not just dominant switches, you're new to DS and you're just exploring, that we all use our voices, and when we run into somebody that we can reach, that is talking about a situation where they might be involved with somebody who is toxic in this way, we talk to them about it, we educate them, and try to do our best so that they can hopefully make the right choices for themselves, educated choices for themselves, rather than thinking that this is just how it is, and that thinking of this is just how it is lifestyle wise. If you watch any BDSM film out there that I have seen, now I haven't seen them all, and I am not the Siskel nor the Ebert of erotic films or films that feature BDSM, but consent is rarely ever seen in them. The Secretary, one of my favorite Kingtastic films. James Spader's character never says, "May I do this?" James Spader's character just sort of does what he wants to do to his secretary, who is obviously more than willing. But that consent portion, that negotiation portion, that safe word portion is not there. And then one of my newer favorite films, The Duke of Burgundy. In that film, there's a lot to love, but there's a scene in there where the dominant willfully disregards their submissive safe word. The submissive clearly says their safe word, and the dominant uses willfully knows this. In when you watch it, you see it firsthand. They know they safe worded and ignore it. So when it comes to media portrayals, we as a lifestyle or the way the lifestyle is portrayed in the media, whether it's film or whatnot, that consent portion is lacking. So if you are, say, just sort of dipping your toes into BDSM because you saw the secretary and liked it, or you saw the Duke of Burgundy and liked it, or perhaps, you saw one of the Shady Gray movies. Once again, there without consent being there, it could be very easy for someone to assume otherwise, run into one of the toxic males, and just assume that consent really doesn't, isn't a part of that. So we have to create a culture of consent. I've jokingly said before that 2024 is going to be the year of consent, and we should, endeavor to talk about it, make sure everyone understands it, because toxic masculinity undermines consent. It just does, simply because these men who are toxic masculinity people, I don't know, toxic masculinity men sounds like a whole lot of men, but they don't respect safe words. They don't respect limits. And they do all of this because they feel entitled because they are a man. So it's very, very important. The other thing that's important that we as a community challenge is, gender. We need to stand up and say that, dominance or submissive don't link to a gender. Anybody can be dominant, anybody can be submissive, anybody can be a switch. Your gender doesn't matter. However, you identify gender wise, it doesn't matter. You can be a dominant, you can be a submissive, and you can be a switch. There is none of that in somebody who refuses to um, refuses to acknowledge that, and they are a man. That is a huge, huge red flag, because they are going to sort of want to enforce, strict gender roles. And Toto, this isn't 1940 anymore. The tornado has blown us into, the 2020s. And yeah, it's not the way it was 80 years ago. There is no going back to that. Now, in your personal relationship, if in your relationship you want to have, the leave it to beaver relationship where the dominant who has a male works and the submissive who is female, stays at home and does all the homemaker things. That's absolutely fabulous, if that works for you. But as long as you're understanding of that, that's not how it has to be for other people. And the other thing, when I see the 1950s sort of people that want to have that style of relationship, if you look back, not that I'm a huge Leave It to Beaver fan, but when I was a few years younger and kind of struggling with a bout of insomnia, it was on TV about the time I realized I couldn't sleep. So I don't know, it was about a week or so. I caught a week's worth of, Leave It to Beaver episodes, uh, which had their moments of kind of hilariousness and oh my God, that's so, so not appropriate anymore. But the one thing I took away from it is so many people on the surface see the housewife as being submissive to the husband. And in some ways, there definitely was that. But at the same time, um, you know, give kind of June Cleaver her props. She got what she wanted when she demanded it. and it wasn't just yes, dear, but it was a mutual respect between them, even though I guess we could say their roles were rather defined. But it wasn't, it was not a TV land representation of toxic masculinity, or at least my sleep deprived brain didn't see it that way. So you may disagree with me there, and you perhaps have much more leave it to beaver experience than I do. So the other thing is that when we challenge toxic masculinity, we are encouraging rather than discouraging emotional expression, um, being vulnerable. Like I said before, if a dominant wants their submissive to be vulnerable, they need to be vulnerable for their submissive. They can't view being vulnerable as a sign of weakness. It's actually a huge sign of strength when you share something as a dominant with your submissive that maybe they're the first person you've shared that with, or told them with it, or shared one of your insecurities that you have. And let's face it, every dominant has insecurities. That's just how it is. And if you run into a dominant, especially one that is male, that says, "Oh, I am dominant, I have no insecurities," my initial reaction to that would be Forrest Gump like, run, Forrest, run away from them. Um, because toxic masculinity does not support mental health. And while it is a stereotype, not everybody involved in BDSM has mental health issues or had mental health issues, but many of us have had mental health issues, whether it was struggling with depression after the loss of a loved one to something much more severe. Mental health issues are common, not only in BDSM, but in the everyday world. And toxic masculinity sort of stigmatizes, it doesn't sort of, it does stigmatize seeking help. And I am somebody who believes that everyone will have a mental health crisis. Now, crisis is very elastic here. A for example, my dealing with depression after the loss of my mom and grandmother and best friend, it was like boom, boom, boom. It all sort of like happened rather quickly. I didn't have time to process one before the next one hit, before the next one hit. And then when it did hit, it hit all at once. And yeah, I was, I had issues, which I have worked long and hard on. And I think we're all works in progress. But toxic masculinity, if I was talking to Toxic Dom, and he was sitting there thumping his chest about how great it is to be a dominant man, they would be putting me down, belittling me, trying to bully me because I admitted that I had mental health issues. I suffered with some depression, not the severe depression that is crippling. I was, able to keep my job. I was able to function, but I was definitely not myself for a while, and we need to be in a place where we support each other and our mental health as well as our physical health. I mean, let's face it, if you have toxic masculinity dom, they're not going to care about your mental health and your physical health. They obviously don't care about that either because they're going to push your boundaries, possibly even not even care when you say for it. So they're not even caring about your physical well-being or mental well-being. Um, So we need to challenge that because everyone's mental health is so important. So this is something that we can't do all alone. I can't do all alone talking about it on just a podcast here. But when you engage with your community, when you find your community, when you find your group of friends, make sure that group or that community that you've kind of feeling like you've found a home doesn't have that toxic masculinity present. That they're not promoting somebody as a leader that is blatantly toxic in these ways. You know, you want to make sure that your community is filled with positive role models, an inclusive community where respect and consent are prioritized. So make sure that you have that. And if you like your community, but you see a lot of toxic masculinity, my advice is to step away from that community and look for something that's a better fit. And I know that's not fun, it's not easy to find that fit. It can seem like it takes forever to find, sort of your group of friends or your community. It's not easy, but sometimes we do need to step away and continue to embark on our quest to find that right group of people. Um, Also look for within your peers and your friends and your community, look for those people in communities that hold people accountable. That if they see somebody exhibiting toxic masculinity, will sadly, I mean, it's not fun to say, but sort of make them outcast, kick them from the group, or try to talk to them, and if that doesn't work, then send them to the curb, and a group that supports you know mental health, a group that supports consent, that doesn't perpetuate gender norms, that you are in a group where no matter your gender, it you can be whoever you want to be. So it's very important that we look for that, and we stay away from groups and people that exhibit toxic masculinity. I really don't think reaching out to toxic masculinity guy is going to make a difference and say, hey, you're exhibiting these behaviors which are toxic. I don't think that person is going to listen. I suppose if it's somebody that is in your circle or in your group, uh, obviously it's probably best to reach out to them because maybe they don't know. Maybe they are completely undereducated with life and the lifestyle, and reaching out can sort of trigger an epiphany or trigger them to go down the road to educate themselves. But it wouldn't hurt before sort of stepping away from them. But it's very, very important that we make good choices and that we choose good people to associate ourselves with. It can be, like I said, it can be very hard to step away from a group that has one or two bad apples, but those one or two bad apples can bring in, three or four more bad apples, and pretty soon what you felt was a good group of people is now populated by more bad apples than good apples. Birds of a feather like to flock together, as the saying goes. So just be aware. And once again, to quote my mom, you are who your friends are. Let's do our best to, confront toxic masculinity where we can, educate people about it where we can, and do our best to continue to make sure the lifestyle is an inclusive, safe place where consent reigns supreme. So that is what I had to say. Thanks to rediscovering the Toxic Avenger series over the last little bit. But I do hope that you agree with me. I would, you know, not like to meet the person who thinks toxic masculinity is a good thing. In the lifestyle, especially outside of the lifestyle, I know I'm going to have contact with those people. You can't always avoid them. Um, but in the lifestyle, we do have choices and we can choose. So please do choose wisely. And at this point, I want to thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to give me a listen. Any feedback you have is always welcome. You can find me pretty much across the board on any social media, from Instagram to Meta's new threads to Facebook to Twitter, Pinterest. All of those are Chatting with the Lightkeeper. And if you haven't yet, I have gone out and created a website, and it is chattingwiththelightkeeper.com. Of course, that's all one word, Chatting with the Lightkeeper, except for the .com. And there you can find all sorts of articles I've written, questions that I've answered. Perhaps even one somebody out there listening has submitted a question. And I also write poetry. I am not going to claim to be a poet, but I enjoy pushing outside of my comfort zone of and writing poems. So I do, to continue to push myself out of that comfort zone, publish them there. So if you're curious about the kind of poems that I write, you can also see those there, learn more about me, because of course there is the About Me section, which I think every website has. So I've got that, and yeah, please do check it out and let me know what you think. And once again, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to give me a listen. And I look forward to chatting with you next week. And the theme for next week will be surprises. So without revealing any more, because that would dilute the surprise, just know next week we will be talking about surprises. So, on that note, I want to say goodbye. Have a great week, and I will talk to you next week.